Good afternoon. It's Adrian and John again, and today we are going to present the methodology utilized in our study, as well as analysis and interpretation of results. After presenting the theoretical foundations of our study, we will now explain the methodological process that guided the research. This study employed a mixed methods approach because it combined quantitative and qualitative data to provide a more comprehensive understanding of the research problem. The quantitative data allow us to measure students' improvement in coherent written communication, whereas the qualitative data help us better understand students' experiences, difficulties, and perceptions throughout the instructional intervention. In addition, the research followed a quasi-experimental design because the participants belong to two pre-existing classes, each one consisting of 25 students. This means that the participant consisted of 50 EFL students enrolled in the second year of senior high school located in Loja, Ecuador. Since the students could not be assigned randomly, one class served as the experimental group and the other as the control group, where Class A was selected as the experimental group, while Class B served as the control group. According to the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, students at this educational level generally demonstrate an English proficiency ranging from A2 to B1. To ensure an ethical data management and participant confidentiality, each student was assigned an identification code such as ACE01, ACE02, or S03. These codes replace students' names throughout the data collection, analysis, and presentation of results. Once the participant had been selected, the research was carried out throughout a 4-week instructional intervention that included explicit instruction on cohesive devices.
The research procedure consisted of several consecutive stages. Before the intervention began, the literature review was developed to establish the theoretical framework supporting the study. Afterwards, the instructional intervention was implemented over 4 weeks, with 2 teaching sessions per week, resulting in a total of 6 instructional sessions. During the first week, both the experimental and control group completed the pretest. In this assessment, students wrote a 150-word academic paragraph entitled "The Importance of Learning English for My Future." After the pretest, the experimental group received explicit instruction on additive cohesive devices. Next, in the second week, the intervention continued with explicit instruction on cause and effect cohesive devices through guided explanations, control practice, group activities, and writing exercises. In the third week, students received explicit instruction on comparison and contrast cohesive devices, applying these connectors in increasingly complex academic writing tasks while receiving continuous feedback. Finally, during the fourth week, both groups completed the post-test using the same writing task administered at the beginning of the study. At the end of the intervention, only the experimental group completed the students' perception questionnaire, and 5 randomly selected students also participated in a semi-structured interview. Throughout the 6 instructional lessons, one observation checklist was completed during each session, resulting in 6 observation records that documented student participation, engagement, difficulties, and progress while learning to use cohesive devices. Well, both the pre-test and post-test were assessed using the same analytic writing rubric, which evaluated 5 dimensions: accuracy of cohesive devices, appropriateness of logical relationships, frequency and distribution, variety of cohesive devices, and contribution to coherence. Each criterion was scored on a scale from 1 to 4, producing a maximum score of 20 points. But to facilitate interpretation of the data, the final scores were converted to a 10-point grading scale. Ultimately, once all the instruments had been administered, the quantitative and qualitative data were organized, tabulated, and analyzed and triangulated to answer the three research questions of the study. And the findings were later presented and interpreted in Chapter 3, from which the conclusions and pedagogical recommendations of the study were derived.
We will now present the findings obtained from our research. The first research question aimed to identify the main problems experienced by students in experimental group when using cohesive devices to achieve coherent written communication before the instructional interventions. As demonstrated by the graph, five major difficulties emerged from the analysis of the collected data. The most frequent problem was the students' over-reliance on basic and familiar connectors, which affected 80% of the participants. Most students tended to use only common connectors such as and, but, and because, while avoiding a wider variety of cohesive devices. One possible explanation is that these connectors are introduced during the early stage of English learning, whereas more academic connectors receive considerably less instructional attention. Another important difficulty involved organizing ideas coherently, which was identified in 76 of the students. Although participants were generally able to produce individual sentences, they often struggle to connect them logically throughout an entire paragraph. Likewise, 72% of the participants demonstrated that a limited understanding of the functions of cohesive devices. Instead of selecting connectors according to the relationship they intended to express, they frequently relied on familiar expressions. Difficulties were also found in the use of cohesive and effect connectors, affecting the 68% of the students, while 56 experienced problems using comparison and control connectors. These logical relationships require learners to analyze ideas more critically before expressing them in writing, which may explain why they represented a greater linguistic challenge. Overall, these findings allow us to identify the specific needs of the experimental group and provided the foundation for designing the explicit instructional intervention implemented during the following weeks.
The second research question examined how explicit instruction affected students' coherent written communication. To answer this question, we compared the writing performance of the experimental and control groups before and after the instructional intervention. The graph reveals that both groups started from a very similar level in the pretest. The experimental group obtained a mean score of 4.12 out of 10, while the control group obtained a 3.94 out of 10. These similar results indicate that both groups shared comparable writing abilities and experienced similar difficulties when using cohesive devices before the intervention. However, a remarkable difference was observed in the post-test. The experimental group increased its mean score to 9.32 out of 10, while the control group obtained only 3.54 out of 10. This substantial improvement may be explained by the explicit instruction received exclusively by experimental group. Throughout the intervention, students participated in 6 instructional sessions that included direct explanations, guided practice, independent practice, group activities, and continuous feedback on the use of additive, cause and effect, and comparison and contrast cohesive devices. Consequently, students became more capable of selecting appropriate connectors, organizing ideas logically, and producing paragraphs with greater coherence. These findings suggest that explicit instruction constitutes an effective pedagogical strategy for strengthening coherent written communication among EFL learners. Now, now, to better understand the improvement observed in the post-test, we analyze students' performance across each criterion of the analytical writing rubric. As illustrated in the graph, positive gains were identified across all 5 assessment criteria, indicating that the instructional intervention contributed to different aspects of students' coherent written communication. Notice that the greatest improvement was observed in the frequency and distribution of cohesive devices, which achieved a gain score of 2.4 points. This may indicate that students became increasingly aware of the importance of using connectors consistently throughout their paragraphs instead of relying on isolated linking words. Likewise, the variety of cohesive devices showed a gain of 2.24 points, suggesting that students expanded their repertoire of connectors and selected them more appropriately according to the communicative purpose of their writing. Another important result was found in the contribution to coherence, which increased by 2.12 points. Since coherence represented the main focus of this study, this finding suggests that explicit instruction helped students construct paragraphs that were more organized, logically connected, and easier to understand for readers. Furthermore, accuracy of cohesive device use improved by 1.88 points, while the appropriateness of logical relationships show a gain of 1.76 points. Although these were the smallest gains, they still demonstrate that students developed a better understanding of how and when cohesive devices should be used to express logical relationships between ideas. The consistent improvement across all 5 rubric dimensions provides strong evidence that explicit instruction on cohesive devices positively influenced students' academic writing and reinforced the coherence of their written communication.
Finally, the third research question explores students' perceptions regarding the contribution of cohesive devices instruction to the improvement of their coherent written communication. Overall, participants expressed highly positive perceptions of the instructional intervention. As shown in the graph, the highest percentage correspond to the strongly agree responses across almost all statements, indicating that students evaluated the intervention very positively. Most students agreed that the lessons helped them better understand the functions of cohesive devices and recognize the logical relationships that connectors express. Likewise, 88% of the participants strongly agreed that they better understood how to use cohesive devices appropriately, as well as the functions of additive, comparison and contrast, and cause and effect connectors. This may have occurred because the instructional sessions combine explicit explanations with guided practice and continuous feedback, allowing students to apply what they learn immediately in their own writing. Students also perceive improvements in the organization and coherence of their academic paragraphs. In addition, 84 strongly agreed that their writing had improved after the instructional intervention, while 80% strongly agreed that they were able to organize ideas and connect sentences more effectively. Another important finding involved students' confidence. 84% of the participants strongly agreed that they felt more confident when writing in English because they knew how to connect ideas more effectively and organize their texts more logically. Furthermore, students recognize cohesive devices not merely as grammatical elements but as essential tools for communicating ideas clearly and coherently. This suggests that intervention helps students develop a more functional understanding of connectors beyond simply memorizing them. These positive perceptions were consistent with the improvements observed in the post-test, suggesting that students' opinions accurately reflected to the progress achieved throughout the instructional intervention. In conclusion, the three research questions collectively demonstrated that the explicit instruction on cohesive devices successfully addressed students' initial writing difficulties, improved their coherent written communicating, and generated positive perceptions toward learning academic writing and English.